The first time I realized my children were waiting for me to die, nobody said the words. It was a cold November morning in Pennsylvania. I was standing at my kitchen counter with a cup of coffee when I saw 3 cars coming up my driveway. All 3 of my children were there. Daniel arrived first. Lauren followed a few minutes later. Ryan came last, almost 20 minutes after the others. For months, I had barely seen them. There had always been a reason: work, schedules, school events, money problems, life. That morning, nobody asked me how I was doing. Nobody asked whether my wrist, which I had injured a few weeks earlier, was still bothering me. Nobody asked whether I had eaten breakfast. Daniel walked into my kitchen carrying a thin folder. That was when I knew this visit was not about me. I set my coffee down and watched him place the folder on the table. Through the window behind him, I could see the land stretching beyond the house. 96 acres that had belonged to my family for generations. 96 acres of pasture, trees, an old barn, a small cabin, and 18 acres that had become especially valuable as development moved closer to our part of Lancaster County. Daniel began talking about property taxes, then maintenance costs, then the money it took to keep the place running. He talked about the land's development potential and how much easier everything would be if we made decisions now. He kept using words like practical, responsible, and fair. Then he said the number, $4.8 million. I looked at him. That number was not something I had shared with my children. The recent professional valuation was in my files, not on the kitchen table. I asked him where he had gotten it. He paused. Then he said it was just an estimate. I knew the difference between an estimate, a guess, and a number somebody had already discussed with a professional. I also knew something else. When someone says, "I'm just trying to help," sometimes what they really mean is, "I want access." I did not say that aloud. I let Daniel continue. I listened. I listened while Daniel talked about selling part of the property. I listened while Lauren mentioned that a smaller house might be easier for me. I listened while Ryan asked questions about what would happen if the 18-acre development parcel were sold. No one directly asked me what I wanted. That was what I could not forget. After they left, I stayed in the kitchen for a few minutes. Their cars disappeared down the driveway one by one. The house was quiet again. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold. Then I walked outside. I crossed the yard slowly and went into the old barn. The barn had always been the place where I needed to think. Robert and I had spent years there fixing things, storing tools, and planning repairs. After he died, I kept going there even when I had nothing to repair. That morning, I stood beside the old workbench and looked at the fence through the open barn doors. Then I noticed the folder sitting where I had left it earlier that week. I picked it up. On the front was a simple label: Whitmore Family Trust, 2019. I ran my fingers over the edge. I did not open it, not because I was afraid of what was inside, because I already knew. 7 years earlier, before my children started asking about the land, before the property became worth millions, before anyone suggested I needed someone else to manage my life, I had made a decision. They thought they had come to discuss my future. They had no idea I had already spent 7 years protecting it. The folder stayed closed on my workbench that morning. I left it there and went back into the house, but I could not stop thinking about the number written across its cover, 2019. 7 years earlier, my life had looked very different. Robert was still alive then, although his illness had already begun taking more from him than either of us wanted to admit. For 19 months, Our lives became a routine built around appointments, hospital corridors, insurance calls, medication schedules, and whatever small repairs needed to be made at home. I drove Robert to his doctor's. I sat beside him during long waits. I learned which questions to ask the nurses and which insurance forms could not be left unanswered. I paid the bills, kept track of prescriptions, and brought him home whenever the doctor said he was well enough to leave. At night, I helped him settle into bed. In the morning, I started again. My children knew what was happening. They were not strangers to it. They called. Sometimes they asked how their father was doing. Sometimes they promised they would come. Daniel was always working. Lauren always seemed to have something already scheduled. Ryan was dealing with his own problems. I remember one conversation with Daniel because it lasted less than a minute. He told me work was crazy and apologized for not being able to come. Lauren promised she would visit the following weekend. Ryan said he wished he could help, but things were a mess for him too. I understood all of it. At least, I told myself I did. The following weekend came and went, then another, then another. Lauren's promised visit became a sentence that never reached the calendar. I did not keep a written record because I wanted to punish them. I kept a calendar because during those 19 months, I needed something that would help me remember what had happened and when. Years later, that calendar became one of the few things I could look at without explaining anything. There were 43 entries related to hospital visits, insurance, medication, roof repair. Some days had several notes written in the same small square. Across that entire period, I found only 7 entries where one of my children's names appeared. 7. I did not need to write down what that meant. The calendar already had. Robert died after 19 months of illness. After the funeral, the house became very quiet. There were flowers for a while. Casseroles appeared on the kitchen counter. People called. Then, gradually, life moved on for everyone except me. I still had 96 acres to manage. The roof needed work. The plumbing had started leaking. The barn needed repairs. Property taxes arrived whether I was grieving or not. Insurance paperwork still had deadlines. There was no dramatic moment when I suddenly became strong. I simply had things that needed to be done. So I did them. I called contractors, I compared estimates, I paid the bills, I learned which repairs could wait and which ones could not. And I kept the property running. My children continued living their own lives. Ryan called one year and asked if I could help him with $8,000. He was struggling financially, and I knew that money would make things easier for him. I gave it to him. Lauren needed help with a car repair. I helped her too. I never resented helping them. What stayed with me was something much smaller. They knew how to call when they needed something. They did not seem to know how to call simply because they wanted to see me. Daniel rarely asked me for money. Instead, he began asking questions about the property. At first, I barely noticed. Then the questions became more specific. How much did I think the land was worth? Had I ever considered selling part of it? What would happen to the property if I eventually moved somewhere smaller? I answered some questions and ignored others. Meanwhile, I began seeing photographs of my children online. They had time for vacations. They had time for Thanksgiving gatherings. They had time for dinners, birthdays, weekend trips, and new cars. I was not angry that they had lives of their own. I was beginning to understand something harder. They did have time. It simply wasn't time they were choosing to spend with me. That realization did not arrive like an explosion. It settled quietly, the way dust settles in a room no one has entered for years. I wasn't angry that they didn't come. I was beginning to understand what their absence meant. And then something changed. The value of the land began rising sharply. The questions became more frequent. The calls became less rare. My children suddenly seemed much more interested in my future, and for the first time, I wondered whether they were really asking about how I was going to live or what they believed would be waiting for me when I was gone. By the time the calls became more frequent, I had stopped mistaking attention for affection. That did not mean I wanted to believe the worst about my children. I still looked for ordinary explanations. Maybe they were finally realizing I was getting older. Maybe they were worried about the work involved in maintaining 96 acres. Maybe Daniel was simply trying to be practical. But the questions kept changing. They were no longer asking how I was doing, they were asking what I planned to do. One Saturday morning, Ryan came by without calling first. He walked around the property with me, but his eyes kept moving toward the eastern side of the land, where the 18 acres sat closest to the newer road. He asked about the fences, then the access road, then whether I had ever received offers for that section. I answered carefully. I had learned something after Robert died. When people ask the same question in several different ways, the wording may change, but the reason usually does not. Ryan said very little after that. Later that afternoon, while we were standing near the barn, he noticed a man in a reflective vest walking along the edge of the property. The man had a clipboard. He was taking measurements. I watched him for several seconds before turning to Ryan. I asked who he was. Ryan looked toward the man and said, "Probably a surveyor." I asked why a surveyor would be there. Ryan did not answer. That silence told me more than an explanation might have. I did not confront him. I did not walk across the field and demand the man's name. Instead, I went back inside and wrote down the date. That evening, I started looking through my records. There was no survey scheduled. There was no contractor I had hired. There was no reason for anyone to be measuring the property. I called Ryan once. He did not answer. I called Daniel. He said he did not know anything about it. Lauren did not return my call until the next day. By then, I had already decided not to ask my children again. I called someone else. Her name was Susan, and she had worked in local real estate for years. I knew her through a professional association from back when I was still running my accounting firm. We had not spoken often in recent years, but she knew the area, knew the market, and understood how quickly a casual conversation about land could turn into something more serious. I explained what I had seen. I gave her the property address. Then I asked her to check whether anyone had recently made inquiries about the land. I expected her to tell me there was probably nothing to worry about. Instead, there was a pause. Susan told me that a developer had made a preliminary inquiry regarding the 18 acres. Not an offer, not a signed agreement, but an inquiry about price and development possibilities. I sat at my kitchen table and listened. The developer had apparently been asking what the parcel might cost and whether there were any known restrictions that would affect development. I had never authorized anyone to speak on my behalf. I had never asked anyone to market the land, and I had certainly never told my children that I wanted to sell it. I thanked Susan and ended the call. Then I opened my laptop. For several minutes, I stared at the screen without touching the keyboard. I could have called Daniel immediately. I could have demanded answers from Ryan. I could have confronted all three of them and asked why they were discussing 18 acres of my property with a developer. But confrontation was not what I wanted. I wanted facts. That distinction had become important to me. I had spent too many years fixing problems before understanding who created them. This time, I was going to understand first. So I closed the laptop. The house was quiet. Outside, the late afternoon light was falling across the fields, and the same land my children had barely visited for years suddenly seemed to be attracting their attention from every direction. I stood there for a moment, then walked to an old drawer in my office. Inside was a phone number I had not used in years. It belonged to David. David had been my attorney for a long time. He had helped me with business matters, property documents, and several complicated financial decisions before Robert became ill. I had not needed him recently, and after Robert's death, I had tried to handle most things myself. But that night, I took the old number out. I looked at it once, then I called. When he answered, I kept my voice calm. "David, it's Claire. I think it's time we review everything." I did not tell him everything over the phone. I did not need to. For the first time since my children had begun asking questions about my future, I was no longer trying to understand what they wanted. I was preparing to understand what I had already put in place. David and I spoke for less than 20 minutes that first evening. I told him what I knew. A man had been measuring part of my property, a developer had asked about the 18 acres, and my children had suddenly become very interested in my land. David listened, took notes, and asked me to send him anything connecting my children to the property discussions. I agreed. For the next few days, nothing happened. Then on a Tuesday morning, my laptop made the small notification sound I had heard thousands of times before. It was an email from Lauren. At first, I thought she had sent me something directly. Then I saw the subject line. It was a family email thread. I opened it. Lauren had apparently been discussing the property with Daniel and Ryan, along with information that appeared to come from a realtor and a developer. There were references to the property's current valuation, possible development, and the idea of moving me into a smaller place. Then I saw the line that made everything suddenly clear. Lauren had sent the entire thread to me by mistake. A few seconds later, another message appeared. "Sorry, Mom, wrong email." I did not answer. I kept reading. The messages were not dramatic. That was almost worse. They were practical. They discussed timing, the realtor, the 18 acres, and how much the property might bring. And then Daniel had written a sentence that I read twice. "We need to get this handled before she changes her mind." I sat at my kitchen table with my hands beside the laptop. There was no argument, no raised voice, no accusation, just a series of sentences written by my children while they apparently believed I would never see them. One sentence stayed with me more than the others. "She can't manage 96 acres forever." I looked through the kitchen window. 2 days earlier, I had repaired part of the eastern fence myself. I had spent the morning measuring the damaged section, replacing the broken posts, and tightening the wire. It had taken me most of the afternoon. Maybe I could not manage 96 acres forever. I knew that. Age does not require a person to pretend otherwise. But there was a difference between recognizing that one day I might need help and allowing someone else to decide that my life was already too difficult for me to control. I closed the email. Then I opened it again. I knew enough about records to understand that an email can be forwarded, copied, misunderstood, or stripped from its original context. So I did not edit anything. I did not highlight the cruelest sentence. I did not add a note saying, "Look what your brother wrote." I printed the entire thread exactly as it appeared. I saved the original email, attachments, and timestamps. Then I forwarded the original message to David. No explanation, no emotional paragraph, just the record. That afternoon, I drove to his office. David reviewed the pages one at a time. He did not react the way I expected. He did not tell me to confront my children. He did not suggest sending them an angry message. He did not encourage me to threaten anyone. Instead, he began reviewing the documents that mattered: the trust, the deed, the beneficiary designations, the medical documentation, the estate planning records. He checked the dates carefully. Then he reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. In 2019,
I had created a revocable living trust. At the time, Robert had already been gone, and I had been thinking seriously about what would happen to the property if I became unable to manage it someday. The trust was not something I created in response to my children's behavior. It was part of responsible planning. I had updated it again in 2022, again in 2024. Each update was made while I was healthy, informed, and completely involved in my own financial decisions. My children had never been told about those changes. That was not because I wanted to surprise them. It was because I had learned something over the years. Privacy was not secrecy. Sometimes privacy was protection. David told me not to retaliate. Do not retaliate. Do not threaten them. Let the documents speak. I understood what he meant. The email had shown me what my children were discussing. The documents would show me what I had actually decided. Before I left his office, I asked one question. What happens if they challenge it? David looked through the documents again. Then we show them you made these decisions while you were healthy, informed, and completely capable. I nodded. Good. That was all I said. I did not call my children that night. I did not tell them that I had seen the email. I went home, put the printed pages into a folder, and placed that folder beside the old one marked Whitmore Family Trust 2019. For the first time, I could see the difference between what my children believed was happening and what was actually happening. They thought the future was something they could arrange around me. They did not yet know that I had been planning for my future long before they started planning for my property.
The first thing I remember after falling was the sound of the barn door moving in the wind. I had been checking a loose section of the roof before winter set in. I stepped around a stack of feed bags, my boot caught on a raised board, and I went down hard. I did not lose consciousness. I did not break my hip. But when I tried to push myself up, pain shot through my wrist, and I knew something was wrong. I managed to reach my phone and call for help. At the hospital, the X-ray showed a fractured wrist and a minor head injury. The doctors wanted to keep me overnight for observation. I was sore, embarrassed, and more frustrated than frightened. Then I called Daniel. He answered, but he could not come immediately. I called Lauren next. She was at work. Ryan said he could not make it that night. I understood that people had responsibilities. I had spent years understanding that. But sitting alone in a hospital room with one hand in a splint, I noticed how quickly the old explanations came back. Work, schedules, plans. There was always something. A little later, a nurse told me someone had come to see me. It was Megan Carter. Megan was a caregiver who had helped me with Robert years earlier and had occasionally checked in on me since then. I had not asked her to come. The hospital had called the emergency contact information I had provided, and Megan had responded. She arrived carrying a small overnight bag. Inside were a clean shirt and pants, my glasses, a phone charger, my medication, my slippers, and the book I had been reading before the accident. She had even brought the book. That detail stayed with me. She had not asked what I needed because she already knew. She knew I hated sleeping in hospital clothes. She knew I could not read without my glasses. She knew my phone would be nearly dead because I always forgot to charge it. She knew which medications I took at night. She knew that when I was nervous, I liked to read a few pages before trying to sleep. None of those things were expensive. None of them required a grand gesture. They simply required paying attention. Megan stayed until I was settled. The next morning, she drove me home after the doctor cleared me to leave. My wrist was immobilized, my head still ached slightly, and I was told to take it easy. By the time we reached the house, Daniel and Lauren were already there. For a moment, I thought maybe they had finally come because they were worried. Then Daniel asked whether I had signed anything at the hospital. I looked at him.
Not whether I was okay, not whether I had been in pain, not whether I slept, whether I had signed anything. I asked why. He said he was just making sure. That answer sat between us. I did not argue. I walked slowly into the kitchen and listened as the conversation shifted almost immediately toward the property. Daniel talked about how difficult it would be for me to maintain the land with a broken wrist. Lauren mentioned assisted living. They talked about finding a smaller place for me, one that would be easier to manage. Then Daniel suggested that he could take over more of my financial responsibilities. He presented it as help, but I heard something else: control. Not because moving to a smaller home would necessarily be wrong, not because assisted living was something shameful. There may come a day when I genuinely need more support, but that decision belonged to me. I had spent 7 years managing my home after Robert died. I had handled taxes, repairs, insurance, contractors, and every ordinary problem that comes with owning land. A broken wrist did not erase those 7 years. Daniel kept talking. Finally, he said the sentence that made everything simple. "Mom, you can't keep doing this alone." I looked at him. Then I looked at Lauren. Then I looked at Megan. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. I thought about the email. I thought about the surveyor. I thought about the 18 acres. I thought about the questions about my property, the sudden concern about my living arrangements, and the trust sitting in my attorney's files. Then I said, "You're right." Daniel seemed relieved. Lauren nodded. But I was not agreeing with the conclusion they had reached. I was agreeing with the fact that I should not handle the next step alone. I turned to Megan. "Megan, call my attorney." The room went quiet. Daniel's expression changed. He had expected me to accept help on his terms. Instead, I was choosing who would help me. I picked up my purse with my good hand and stood. My wrist hurt. My head still ached. But for the first time since I had fallen, I felt completely clear. I looked at Megan and said, "Actually, take me to my lawyer." And that was the moment the hospital visit stopped being about my injury. It became the moment I stopped allowing other people to decide what my weakness meant.
When Megan drove me to David's office, I did not feel like I was walking into a courtroom. I was walking into a room where I had spent years making decisions I never expected my children to question. David had been my attorney since before Robert died. He knew the property, the old paperwork, and the changes I had made over the years. He also knew that I did not want revenge. I wanted clarity. He did not begin by telling me what my children would lose. He began by asking me what I wanted protected. Then he opened the file. The first document was the revocable living trust I had created in 2019. David explained that it had been properly executed and funded with the property interests it was meant to cover. It was not something he had created after the hospital incident. It was not a secret document invented to punish my children. The next documents were the updates I had made in 2022 and again in 2024. Each had been signed while I was healthy, informed, and making my own decisions. Records showed that I had met with David independently and understood what I was changing. David also had the property deed. The latest independent appraisal valued the entire property at approximately $5.17 million. Then David showed me the part that explained everything. 18 acres near the road had been identified as a potential development parcel. Based on the current market and preliminary interest from developers, those 18 acres were worth approximately $2.9 million. That was the piece Daniel had been asking about. The surveyor had not appeared by accident. The developer conversation had not come from nowhere.
And the email I had received was not an isolated misunderstanding. My children had been looking at the same number from a very different direction. David turned to the next section. There were separate inheritance provisions for Daniel, Lauren, and Ryan. I had not cut my children out. Daniel would receive his inheritance separately, Lauren would receive hers separately, Ryan would also receive an inheritance, but his would include financial protections because of the instability surrounding his finances. The trust was designed so that his inheritance could support him without immediately becoming another source of debt, pressure, or poor decisions. There was also a provision for Megan. It was $12,000. Not millions, not the property. It was simply my way of recognizing years of practical care. David continued through the file. There was an independent medical capacity evaluation. There were records showing that I had understood my assets, my obligations, and the consequences of my estate decisions. There were documentation of my independent meetings with professionals. There were copies of my instructions. And then there was the email chain. The accidental email from Lauren, the discussion about the realtor, the developer, the valuation, the plan to move me into a smaller place, Daniel's message about handling everything before I changed my mind. David had preserved the original email exactly as it had arrived. No edits, no additions, no interpretation, just the record. I did not want anyone to believe I had twisted their words. Their own words were enough. Then David showed me the part of the trust that mattered most. I had chosen not to leave the entire property to one person. I had also chosen not to destroy my children's inheritance. Instead, the trust protected the 96 acres as a family asset. The land could continue to support the family, but no one child could simply sell the whole property because they wanted cash. I retained the right to live on the land for the rest of my life. After my death, the property would remain inside the Family Preservation Trust. Income from designated portions of the land could be distributed according to the trust. My children could benefit financially, but they could not dismantle the entire legacy for one large payout. A portion of the future proceeds would also support a small community fund connected to the land. It was not about making my family suffer. It was about making sure the land could outlive the worst decision any one of us might make. I sat there for a while, looking at the documents. For years, I had believed that treating my children fairly would make them understand fairness. I had been wrong. Fairness and access were not the same thing. David finally asked me whether I wanted to change anything. I looked at the trust again. Then I said, I didn't write them out because I hated them. I paused before adding, I wrote the trust because I loved them enough to stop money from deciding who family meant. That was the part I needed to remember. I was not removing my children from my life with a pen. I was removing money from the position of deciding who deserved to stand closest to me. And for the first time, the documents in front of me did not feel like weapons. They felt like boundaries I had written while I still had the strength to make them.
When they finally came into David's office, I brought no anger with me. I wanted my children to hear the facts exactly as they were. Daniel was the first to react. He looked at the documents, then at me, and the hurt in his face quickly turned into accusation. He could not understand how I had made decisions about the property without telling him. He asked whether I trusted them. I looked at him and said, "Trust isn't something you inherit." After that, David walked them through the timeline. He started with 2019, when I established my revocable living trust. Megan was nowhere in those documents. She was not a beneficiary. She was simply someone who had helped me and Robert over the years. Then came 2022, when I made the first major update.
Again, Megan was not added. In 2024, I ordered an independent appraisal of the property. That was before the recent arguments, before the surveyor, and before my children began talking about selling the development parcel. In 2025, I completed an independent medical review. The purpose was simple: to document that I understood my financial situation and could make my own decisions. Then came 2026, when I made the final amendment. David placed each document in order from 2019 to 2023, 5 points in time showing that my estate plan had developed over years, not overnight. Daniel still did not accept it. He turned toward Megan and accused her of manipulating me. He suggested that she had influenced my decisions because she stood to receive money from the trust. Megan did not defend herself. She did not need to. I stopped Daniel before the accusation could become another argument. Don't blame her for something I decided. The room became quiet. Megan had not asked me to create the trust. She had not asked for the $12,000 provision. She had not told me to change my estate plan. She had not been present when I met David in 2019, when I updated the trust in 2022, when I ordered the appraisal in 2024, or when I completed the medical review in 2025. The records showed all of that. Lauren began to cry. She was not crying because she had lost the property. She was crying because she finally understood that I had been making these decisions long before the family argument began. She asked why I had never told them. I thought about that question for a moment. The easy answer would have been that I was protecting myself. The harder answer was that I wanted to know what their relationship with me looked like when there was nothing obvious to gain. So I told her the truth. Because I wanted to see what you would do when you thought I had nothing left to give. I did not say it to punish her. The truth was already sitting on the table in front of all of us. The missed visits, the questions about the property, the developer, the 18 acres, the email about moving me into a smaller place, the sudden concern about who should control my finances. None of those things had been created by the trust. The trust had simply made their meaning harder to ignore. Ryan had said almost nothing. He looked at the documents, then at the floor. For once, I did not need to know what he was feeling. I was not there to force an apology. David explained that Daniel would still receive an inheritance. Lauren would receive hers. Ryan would receive his under the financial protections already established in the trust. They were not being erased. They were simply no longer being given control over the property. That distinction mattered. I did not want my children homeless. I did not want them ruined. I wanted to remain in my home while I was alive. I wanted my land protected. I wanted the family to benefit from it without allowing one person to sell everything for a quick payout. And I wanted my children to understand that inheritance was a gift, not a management position. I looked at Daniel before we left. I don't want you ruined. I just don't want you planning my life while I'm still living it. Nobody argued with that. Daniel would lose his ability to control the property, but he would not lose everything. The trust would still provide for him. That was the difference between justice and cruelty. Cruelty would have been destroying them because they had disappointed me. Justice was allowing the consequences of their choices to exist without destroying their future. I did not feel victorious when we left David's office. There was no satisfaction in watching my children confront the consequences of their choices. What I felt was something quieter: relief. For years, I had carried the responsibility of protecting the land and protecting myself without knowing whether anyone understood why. That day, I no longer needed them to agree with me. That day, I understood something I never expected. Sometimes protecting your family means refusing to let money become the loudest voice in the room. When some time had passed, the house became quiet again. I was still living on the property.
My wrist had healed, the barn repairs were finished, and the routines of my life slowly returned. Megan continued helping me when I needed her. She never behaved like someone who had suddenly become an heir. She was still the same person who brought my glasses at the hospital and remembered the little things. I also began using the property differently. One section of the barn had been sitting mostly empty, so I decided to turn it into a small community learning space. We held sessions about financial literacy, basic estate planning for older adults, and practical money skills for local students. Some property income helped support those programs. I liked that. The land was still providing for people, but not in the way my children had imagined. It was not simply a number waiting to be converted into cash. It could be useful while I was alive. A few months later, Lauren came back. She did not call first to ask about the trust. She did not mention the property. She did not ask whether I had changed my mind. She stood at my door holding a cake. She looked uncomfortable, almost like she wasn't sure whether I would open the door. Then she simply said, "I thought you might like this." I looked at the cake, then at her. For a moment, neither of us knew what to do with the silence. Instead of reopening the old argument, I stepped aside. "Come in." It did not mean everything was forgiven. It did not erase the emails, the arguments, or the months when I had wondered what my children really wanted from me. But it was a door opening. Ryan changed slowly. He started paying down his debts himself. I knew he was struggling, and for the first time, I didn't immediately reach for my checkbook. That was difficult. Helping him had always felt easier than watching him struggle. Ryan began making payments, cutting expenses, and taking responsibility for decisions that belonged to him. Daniel was different. There was no sudden redemption. He remained angry for a long time. He believed I had treated him unfairly, and I couldn't force him to see things differently. Then, one afternoon, I received a short message from him. "I understand now." I read it twice. I did not answer immediately. Eventually, I wrote, "I hope you do." That was enough. I didn't need a perfect family ending. I needed an honest one. Years earlier, I had believed my greatest responsibility was to leave something valuable behind for my children. Standing outside that barn one quiet morning, I realized I had misunderstood the assignment. I looked across the 96 acres. I did not see $5.17 million. I saw the house where Robert had lived. I saw the barn I had repaired with my own hands. I saw the trees changing with the seasons, the old fence line, the road leading towards town, and the kitchen window where I had spent so many mornings drinking coffee before the world woke up. The property was worth millions, but that was not what made it valuable to me. The life inside it was. For years, I thought my job was to leave something behind for my children. Then I realized I had confused inheritance with legacy. Inheritance is what you leave someone. Legacy is what you teach them while you're still here. I had spent years protecting land. In the end, I learned that the more important thing was teaching the people I loved that love and access were not the same thing. I didn't take my children's inheritance away. I simply stopped letting them inherit me before I was gone.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.